I mean, as predicted, Lando's biggest problem always was going to be Oscar Piastri, and I never changed my tune on that, and I stand by it today. You know, Lando. I mean, the thing about Lando, I was thinking about him out this morning when we were going for a walk, was that he does have weekends when he's just perfect from beginning to end, isn't he? And he gets it absolutely right, and there's no way Oscar can live with him unless Oscar does something really special. And then he has these other weekends. And, you know, I remember when he was driving for Carlin in, was it F2 or GP2? I can't remember what it was back then. But I remember he wasn't going that well. And there was a moment, I think it was in Barcelona, and he just drove into the wrong garage during a pit stop. And I remember talking to the Carlin guys. I said, yeah, you know, I don't know what's going on with Lando. It's kind of weird. You know, he's kind of going through some sort of brainstorm. And I wonder whether that's a sort of Lando trademark now. He has these weekends. I mean, I'm always the last in the world always to talk about form. I think it's just a cop-out really to say, oh, he's on good form or bad form. It's usually some technical issue, whether you're a cricketer, footballer, computer scientist, whatever it is, there's always an issue that perhaps make you look as if you're having an off-form day, and you need to work out what that is in a scientific, logical way. And I suspect it's the same with Lando, but a lot of people probably will just write it off. Oh, he was off form in Bahrain. You know, well, what does that mean? You know, does that mean he was braking too harshly into one in qualifying with that extra toe and the extra speed that he had? And as a result of that, he then didn't really feel confident for the remaining two sectors because he didn't want to blow the lap completely. And does it mean qualifying sixth, the most he was ever going to do was finish third? And then there's the other psychological side of Lando, which is the engineer saying, you know, trying to G him up and saying, you know, Russell doesn't think he can go the distance on the softs. You're in good shape. You're on the best tires for the restart, blah, blah, blah. And Lando's rejoinder is, oh, no, those soft tires are great. You know, they're mega tires. Wish I was on those sort of thing, which is almost talking himself out of it. You know, I can't imagine in a million years, Nigel Mansell in that situation ever thinking the guy in front had got any advantage over him whatsoever. And Nigel's only methodology would have been, I'm the fastest guy out there. I'm going to pass this guy, and I'm out of there. You know, I'm going to be on the podium, stroke win this race. He would never think any other way. And it wasn't just thinking that way. It was believing that. It was believing that from the heart, you know, and right inside him. And you just get the feeling that some weekends Lando just doesn't have that. Maybe, as I said a couple of conversations ago, maybe he's too intelligent. I don't know, because Oscar Piastri is the flip side of that. He's laid back, very calm, doesn't overthink it, doesn't overcomplicate it, just loves driving racing cars. He's always on the edge, always on the limit, and nothing phases him. This is the guy he's got to beat. That's as I keep saying, you know, this is the biggest problem Lando's got. I mean, Mark, you say I'm not a sports psychologist. I'm very glad I'm not, because I don't actually believe in sports psychologists at all. I think it's all mumbo jumbo, and it's much more simple than athletes or racing drivers try to make out. And I gave you my game plan for Lando Norris last winter, and it was forget all social media for a start, forget having a profile, forget being the smooth professional Formula One driver. You're rough, tough Lando Norris. I mean, that is obviously going to an exaggeration, but deep inside, you've got to have that burning feeling of, you know, you've got to be John McEnroe complaining about this, complaining about that. You've got to be Nigel Mansell moaning about Alan Prost having a better car at Ferrari or whatever. You've got to be like that, because you've got to be fighting your own battle, and you've got to be a human being who believes 100% that it's your given right to be world champion. You've got to be tough. And I think social media and the whole business of being a Grand Prix star is, you know, it's a bad era for Lando to be racing in. He would have been much more comfortable racing in the 70s or 80s probably, because all this stuff is confusing him, I think. And I've said that from day one. Get rid of the social media. I'm completely astonished, to be honest, that Zach hasn't made him do that, because Zach's a racer. You know, he's just as happy to be at Snetterton watching his endurance team testing on a Thursday afternoon in the rain as he is to be in the sun in Bahrain. And he knows what racing's all about. And it's pretty logical to me that Lando Norris needs to just get in the ditch, get dirty, and come out fighting. That's how he needs to be. And he was that racing driver when he was much younger. Now he's too polished. He's too polished, and that's the problem with Lando. And the minute there's an issue, it becomes a confused mess of the polished Lando versus the Lando who's just made a mistake, and how to react to it all and what to do. You don't admit, you know, you don't concede to your engineer that you think the guy in front's on better tires. when he's on softs, you know. What was that all about? Lando had the prime tyre strategy for the Grand Prix. If you look at Pirelli's, you know, proposed best race tyres for the race, it was exactly what Lando had: soft, medium, medium. No argument about that. We can get on to what Ferrari did in a minute. But for Lando to start saying on the radio, oh no, George is on better tyres, it was just ridiculous. I've never heard anything like that, actually. That was bizarre. I wish he'd got back to his engineer when he was telling him in Hungary not to win, to give the win to Oscar. I wish he'd said, what are you talking about? Sorry, can't hear the radio, turn it off. I wish he'd done that. And if he'd done that, he'd be a better racing driver today. He'd be tougher, harder, meaner, leaner. And I dare say Oscar wouldn't be quite as able to tread all over him as he is. And that's I always said it was the biggest mistake Lando could make was to give that win to Oscar in Hungary last year. A bit like David Coulthard giving the win to Mika Hakkinen in Melbourne. From that race onwards, Mika always had it. As I've always maintained, I think Oscar still has much more potential than he's showing now, and that is going into short corners on slower and medium speed corners. I think right now Kimi Antonelli is actually better on slow corners than Oscar Piastri, but Oscar's very, very good. But he could be better there. I think that's one area where he can improve. Medium speed or fast corners, he's just fabulous, and James Hunt like, and when James was at his peak, and I think that I mean it's part of it is Lando making mistakes, and part of it is Oscar not making mistakes and knowing what he does really well and doing it because he's uncluttered, he's unflustered, and he's relaxed, and he gets out there and he just drives the car. Whereas Lando is making these mistakes. Lando needs to just become a much meaner racing driver and believe in himself 100% and not really look at what Oscar's doing. That's part of the problem in Formula One. Your opponent, your biggest opponent is your teammate. That's the guy you got to beat because he's in the same car. And yet teams insist on having all this interplay of information from one side of the garage to the other, studying one another's telemetry. The engineers get together in the debrief. They all exchange their information. And I'm sure at McLaren, there's more information exchanged probably than any other team because it's a well-run team in the sense that it's a corporate entity and there's no hidden secrets. I mean, to me, that doesn't work. That's not motor racing. To me, there should be a barrier between the two. And if one driver wants to pay his mechanics a bit extra, if he gets a few points in the championship, a bonus on the side, go and do it. And if one driver wants to hold back a little bit of information, yeah, that's what happens in motor racing. And I suspect, Oscar plays that game better than Lando Norris for sure. And I'm not saying he keeps anything back, but I would bet that there are moments when Oscar has said something like, oh yeah, I've got a bit of mid-corner understeer there or whatever. And then they go into the session with a setup that in theory is going to give them the mid-corner understeer. And when Lando looks at the telemetry later, he hasn't got any mid-corner understeer. And it'll be that sort of thing. And then Lando will probably get confused because he's the guy that's being the nice guy and giving all the information and giving the win to him in Hungary and all the rest of it. And Oscar's a race driver, he's not stupid. He's a race driver and he's a very clever guy. So that's why I keep saying Lando needs to forget about Oscar Piastri, forget about the engineers, forget about telemetry, forget about social media, and just drive the car on gut feel and get on with it. That's what needs to happen. But it won't. Of course it won't. McLaren will never let that happen in a million years because they've got too many people employed to make sure that doesn't happen in all their committees everywhere. Yeah. I think he said that, didn't he? 25 is my year or something like that. And that's a big thing to say with Oscar Piastri in the other car. If Clay Regazzoni was in the other car, or Sergio Perez, or Valtteri Bottas, 100%. But, Oscar Piastri in the other car, and you're saying, oh, it's going to be my year. Talk about red rag to a bull. Because Oscar would have seen that, for sure. If not, Mark Webber would have seen that. So, that was not a good thing to say. And again, it's a good example of why he shouldn't be doing interviews, shouldn't be doing social media, shouldn't be doing any of that rubbish and just becoming a hard, fast racing driver. And what we're seeing, I think, is a backlash to the way the winter went for Lando Norris, potential world champion. You should never think that way. Over the winter, it should have been digging deep, back to fundamentals. These are all things that are going to go wrong. These are the things I haven't done very well. I'm going to work on them absolutely flat out. I don't want any commitments, nothing. Flat out, this, I'm going to work on that. Throttle here, brake there, steering, whatever. And I don't know. Maybe that didn't happen. Maybe he did too many social media things. Maybe he's believing the social media because inevitably it permeates the psyche, doesn't it? And that's a problem. That's a problem when you got a guy like Oscar. He's very low profile, relatively low for a racing driver. I'm not saying he should be thinking eat, sleep, drink Formula One and work on it 1,000% throughout the winter. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying his extracurricular activities, as you call them, should be karting in the rain at Rye House, or you know, rallying in secret up in the Welsh forests, or something that's healthy for a racing driver to do. It shouldn't be anything to do with social media or polish or image or branding or any of that stuff, especially if your number one threat is your teammate. And you've got to think about how within that team, you've got to be the fastest guy. You've got to be quicker than him in every qualifying session, and you've got to outrace him in every Grand Prix. That is your task. And that's presumably what he didn't set himself over the winter. Because why else? Why would he have said, this is my year? You know, you wouldn't say that if you were thinking, because you would think Oscar Piastri ain't slow, you know. And I'm not, and I'm clearly, Lando Norris, I'm not Max Verstappen. I'm bright enough to know that, but I'm going to be as good as Max. I'm going to work as hard as I can to be as good as Max. But my threat is Oscar Piastri. You know, it's an unusual situation. That's why I keep going on about it, because when you've got two teammates, both capable of winning Grand Prix and therefore World Championships in a championship winning car, it can never ever be a happy, friendly ship. Never. It will never be that way. So you have to build up a resilience to the other side of the garage. You've got to start protecting your own assets. And in his own way, Nelson Piquet did that very well with Nigel Mansell. You know, he went the Honda route, persuading Honda that he was the driver that they should be giving the best engines to, and then he should take the engines away from Williams and take them to Lotus. Or, you know, or when Keke Rosberg was at Williams alongside Nigel, it was, well, you know, of course, the Williams team are going to favour the English driver periodically, things like that. You know, you've got to start thinking that way. You might call it a bit childish, I'm sure Lando would, but that's the only way you can fight it. Because if you try to be balanced with a guy you've got to beat in the same car, it'll always end badly. Always, in motor racing, in my experience. Look at Prost Senna, you know. You think they were buddies? And that's the problem. And the other problem is Oscar is very, very good. I'm not saying this is a duplicitous thing. It's not. But he's very, very good at being a really cool guy, which he is, out of the car, and being a nice guy. And I'm sure Lando enjoys being with him. And he's very, very good at being an unbelievably fast, good racing driver in the car. And that's quite unusual, actually, because, you know, Prost would probably say Senna wasn't the most pleasant of people to hang out with out of the car either. But that's not the case between Lando and Oscar. Oscar is a cool guy, but he's got this other side of him, you know, and that's the problem Lando's got, as I've been saying all winter, you know. And my only solution to how to fight that was to get off social media, get off all the profile and brand building, and just focus 100% on how to beat this guy. Every little small thing you can do that gives you an advantage against Oscar Piastri in the McLaren team, you've got to go for it. And don't get me wrong, there will be weekends, as I said, there will be weekends when Oscar makes a mistake in qualifying and Lando's in front, and he'll have a great weekend and he'll win the Grand Prix. He's going to win plenty of races this year, but it's going to be close. I'm not saying he's not going to win the World Championship, but it's going to be much closer than Mr. Norris thought it was going to be, I'm sure.